Okay, good evening. Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Jones. I'm an associate professor here at the Blavatnik School of Government. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's topic and tonight's speakers. Great to see so many people turn out. We're going to make this quite an interactive session, so please make sure you've got your questions, your thoughts at the ready. Please do share them. So the topic we're going to discuss this evening is sustainable growth in low-income countries. What policies should governments pursue? And we were prompted to hold this session because two gentlemen from the IMF who are with us tonight wrote a really interesting paper earlier this year that caused quite a bit of controversy called The Return of the Policy That Shall Not Be Named, The Principles of Industrial Policy, and really argued against a lot of the sort of received wisdom that we've heard over the last 20 years, and they will tell us more. But we're really here to discuss what are the policies that governments can pursue to spur industrialization and economic development, the transformation of economies, particularly low-income countries, in a context of globalization and in the context of climate change. So just to introduce our three speakers, Reda, Cherif, and Fuad Hasanov are both senior economists at the fund. They're also adjunct professors of economics at Georgetown University, and they're going to present the essence of their paper for 25 minutes, something like that. And then we're delighted to have Joaquim Levy, who's the former finance minister of Brazil, also generously joining us here this evening. Thank you so much. As a discussant to this paper, you're also here as the Lehman Visiting Fellow of Practice at the Blavatnik School, working on policies to move in Brazil to a net carbon zero economy by 2050, is that right? So we're looking forward to really, or before. So we're really looking forward to those interventions on the sort of climate and sustainability angle in this as well. Before they start, just to remind us that we're live streaming this event. So just so you know, you can also look on YouTube later on our YouTube channel to watch it, and you can recommend to friends who didn't make it tonight. Before we turn over to our presenters, any burning questions, thoughts? What is it that you've come to find out tonight? It'd be really nice to get, for us all, and our presenters, to get a bit of a feel about the questions on your mind. So just for a few interventions, what are the things you'd like to find out within the next hour and a half? Any thoughts? Yeah, gentleman at the back. Please do briefly introduce yourself as well. Great, so that old question of, is the government smart enough to do this? Great, other thoughts, other questions that people would like the answer to? Yeah.
Hello, I'm doing a PhD on international development, and the question would be on the role of FDI and local funds in generating that green tech solution. What is the role of each foreign fund and multinationals?
Yeah.
And developing local funds?
Great. Wonderful. So they're foreign and local. Yes, please.
So my question would be whether the current trade regime limits our ability to have industrial policies or to turn into low carbon economy.
Okay, great. So the trade rules provide a constraint. Okay, let's get two more hands up. Okay, three more hands up. Okay, great. Let's hear these three, and then we'll turn over to our speakers. Yeah.
My question is the world globalizes further and further and become more and more dependent on one another? Can our international organizations keep pace with this and be effective throughout this process?
So that international organizations like the fund kind of keeping pace with all of this. Brilliant. Yeah, gentleman at the back and then gentleman here. Sorry, you have to shout. The audio is pretty good, but it's not great. Yes, big topic at the moment. So how Brazil's government relates to its environment. And yeah, gentleman at the front here.
My name is Samuel. My name is Industrial Branding. My question would be, at what cost will you have that sustainable clothing? The trade-offs, especially when it comes to environmental degradation, like what is happening in Brazil.
Yeah. So really that growth environment trade-off in particular. So at what cost are we pursuing this growth agenda? Any women want to have any questions? Because that was a lot of questions from the men there. Come on, ladies, we can do this. Open floor. Yeah, go on, thank you.
Because you called
we have to do these things, right?
Well, that's true. Thank you. I'm curious as to learn about the policies that you share and how this probably can be replicated in some other parts of the developing world. I myself am from the South, so I'm very curious, just like what you were saying, at what cost does this policy come to? And secondly, also about accountability for other nations, because mostly when we talk about sustainable growth and tied to things like climate crisis, then the lower income countries mostly face the brunt of development, to which they have not really participated in. But then they must hold probably others in account. So how do policies sort of encompass that?
Great, so two questions there on replicability across countries, and then the second one, this question about inter-country justice, if you like, or the impact of some growing fast, and then do they close perhaps the space for others, particularly in a carbon-intense world. Right, last question to you, go on.
I want to know if our speakers think it's fair that low-income countries have to focus on sustainable growth when high-income countries pursue so much environmental degradation to get to the level of the economy that they've reached.
Okay, great. So a related question to this environmental justice one. Okay, there are clearly more. Don't worry, we'll get to them. I will now turn the floor over. Don't feel obliged to answer all of these at once, but please, you've prepared some slides in the presentation we'd love to hear, but I hope that gives us all a feel of what is on people's minds. So please come and join us, and please do present. And I'll give you a 5-minute warning or so.
All right.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much, Emily. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting us. So I'll start, and Reda will take the hard part. So I'll talk about the easy part. I guess the title of our paper is kind of fitting, to Oxford. It's I guess, the land of Harry Potter, so it kind of fits exactly the idea. We don't really talk much about industrial policy, but it's kind of been coming back, and in a way, kind of it fits the general idea. Although I'm not sure it's going to be as scary as Voldemort, right? So we'll find out. So let me start with this quote by late founder of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, who, if you read this, he basically said, will Singapore be around in 100 years? And he kind of emphasized the important role of the state, right? So he said, if we get dumb government, we're going to sink into nothingness. Right? So I guess I want to emphasize the role of the state. We tend to talk a lot about the private sector, but we don't want to neglect the role of the state. So this is the plot of GDP per capita relative to the US in 1970s on horizontal line, vis-a-vis GDP per capita relative to the US in 2014. So this is from Penwall tables, the latest data that we have in purchasing power parity terms, so we can compare across countries. And what you see, so you have 45-degree line that's growing as much as the US, roughly about 2% growth in terms of GDP per capita. Bless you. And then we have this horizontal and vertical line. So the 20% is basically a threshold of the that relates to the low middle income, upper middle income. So above 20% will be upper middle income countries, and above 50% will be the high income countries. So it roughly corresponds to the 75th percentile of the distribution and the median of the distribution. And what you see here is many countries are kind of around this 45-degree line. So they grow, some grow faster. So advanced countries are in this upper corner over there to the right. You have the middle income trap, which is here in the middle, and then kind of low and low middle income countries. So you see some countries are rising from low to low middle to upper middle, but very few make it to the advanced country status, right? And so if you look at the numbers, I think there were about 148 low and low middle and upper middle income countries, and only 13 of them made it to high income countries, right? In a span of basically almost 50 years. So it's not many, so there are not many countries who've made it, right? And the question is why we don't see it, at least within a certain span, right? Some countries are growing faster than the US, like Malaysia and Chile, but it will take them, many years to reach that threshold. And most of these countries either discovered oil, or they were kind of in the periphery of the kind of the core European Union countries, right? So that kind of helped them a lot. And the only countries and kind of the only economies that were outside of these two key regions were basically the Asian miracles, right? So these are Hong Kong, Taiwan province of China, you have Singapore, and you have Korea, right? And Singapore is not even on the chart because it's 20% above US GDP per capita, so it's off the charts, literally, right? So, so the question is, what can we learn from them, right? And this quote from the Nobel Prize winning physicist talks about, what is important is not the averages, it's really the tails of the distribution. And in the paper, we kind of go into some of the technical details, kind of looking at the power of the distribution. And it's really the information's in the tails, right? We want to free ourselves from average thinking. But as economists, we always tend to run regressions, right, which is basically about averages of some sort, to a large extent. Right? And what we want to do here is we want to look at the Asian miracles and kind of distill the lessons or principles. And once you look through those principles, what we call a true industrial policy, effectively it's a technology and innovation policy, which happens to have the same acronyms, right? So it will give you a tip for growth, I guess. Maybe we're a bit ambitious here, but I guess it's one of the important tenets. You got to be ambitious to make it to high-income country status. So these are the three key principles that we summarize based on what we've learned from the Asian miracles. So the first one is really about going into sophisticated sectors, right? Usually private sector by itself won't do that, so you need the state intervention to a large extent. And kind of the extent of your leapfrogging to this technology or sophisticated sectors, and also the extent of the technology creation by domestic firms, which is one of the questions that was asked, will determine how far you'll jump or how far you'll grow over a long period of time. So kind of snail crawl, you do a little bit, you leapfrog, kind of get to middle income trap, and then, or moonshot is basically the Asian miracles. Right? So that's how roughly we classify the policies and also the outcomes. And the second important one is exports. It's really about exports, export-oriented strategies. Creates a completely different dynamics compared to kind of the failed industrial policies of the past, which was mostly import substitution types of policies, right? And the third one is about competition and support provided to the private sector, and of course the accountability, right? So it's not unconditional support, right? And this is also important. Once you have these three, we believe that kind of provides a recipe for high sustained growth. So if kind of we delve into some of these details, so I emphasize the importance of export orientation. That's important vis-a-vis import substitution or non-tradables. Many countries, that's pretty much what they do. They kind of go into import substituting policies, protections. We don't want to create competition. So you protect the market and create completely wrong incentives. And also non-tradables, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really provide you with foreign exchange, doesn't provide you with the signals and also global markets, right? So it's completely different, like real estate and things of this sort. So it doesn't really generate sustained growth. The second element is kind of what many oil exporters did in the past, kind of domestic capabilities versus portfolio diversification. Norway, in the 70s, when they discovered oil, they went really into creating domestic firms, right? And they've created their own capabilities vis-a-vis many other oil exporters in Latin America and Middle East who kind of just imported the technology and kind of stopped there. Right? So there's differences in how you go about it, even in the commodity sectors. And the third point, if you had to create a dynamic export sectors, you gotta think about sophisticated sectors rather than kind of there's a lot of discussion about services, not much productivity gains probably there. Tourism is how much you can get out of tourism. It's the same activity as probably 40 years ago. Restaurants, hotels. What else can you get there? And the last one is kind of related to this, kind of going beyond competitive advantage vis-a-vis staying within the competitive advantage. And Chile is a nice example. They did pretty much around the competitive advantage. They developed sectors such as salmon, blueberries, and so on, versus Korea, Malaysia, who kind of jumped and went into electronics, cars, and things of this sort. Right. So I've said a lot of things about sophistication, sophisticated sectors. So the question is, what is a sophisticated industry? And if you kind of rank the industries based on R&D intensity, right? The amount of R&D in sales or percent of GDP. You end up with these kind of these sectors which are pretty much manufacturing, electronics, cars, and things of this sort, and some services like professional scientific services, ICT, and software. Right? So these are kind of the industries that we call sophisticated. They have a lot of R&D component. And actually, these are exactly the industries that many Asian miracles went to. Right? They're the main exports of the Asian miracles. So the question is, if these are the things we need to do, then how come the private sector doesn't do them? Right? And that's kind of the argument goes back to our previous work on oil exporters, that the standard growth policy advice may not be sufficient because what we call kind of market failures. Right? And this is Econ 101, basically. You know, the private sector won't go into the risky markets like manufacturing, many oil exporters. No, why would you do that? Because you'll be losing money for 20 years. Coordination, if you want to build a car industry, just one firm is not enough. You need the whole cluster of firms to go in. So you're coordinating amongst all these firms. You need somebody or the state to intervene. And that's kind of and then learning by doing type of arguments, that you learn as you produce. Which you won't incorporate as a single firm. You may not incorporate that into your decision making. And many of these oil exporters in the Gulf, especially, say, Arab Emirates, they've done all this, low regulations, low taxes, you name it. There's not much non-oil export sector there, right? So the question is, why not? And that's kind of our argument. So you need the leading hand of the state, as we call it in this book, edited in 2016. With Minju. And this is the leading hand of the state, right? So you need the state intervention. Okay, and let me give you one example, and then I'll pass it on to Reda. Kind of second principle was about exports, right? So the first principle is about sophistication. Second principle is about exports. And what is important here, kind of we contrast two countries and two sectors. One sector, the auto industry in two countries, Malaysia's Proton and Korea's Hyundai. And what Malaysia did was pretty much trade protection. They protected the industry. I mean, they had two pretty much car companies. Proton was the biggest. And eventually, nothing really happened, and it was sold relatively recently to Geely. Right? So they couldn't really break through and didn't export and wasn't really successful. Although it did generate, of course, some capabilities and things of the sort, right? So they just didn't go far enough. Hyundai, from day one almost, had in mind to export, shooting for the US market. Of course, took them a while. I think they started with Canada first and then kind of moved down to the US. But that was their initial idea, and kind of move first, then adjust as needed. And they started producing their own engine, which Malaysians never did. They were importing Mitsubishi engine up till a few years ago, right, until they were bought out. And Hyundai produced its own engine in 1991. And then, of course, there was competition across several chaebols. And, of course, we know just one of two survived. And Samsung used to also produce cars, right? It's just not all of them survived. So competition was also an important element, not only on the international arena, but also on the domestic arena, right? And this, we believe that this kind of differentiated why Hyundai succeeded and Proton hasn't, right? And I'll give it to Reda to talk about some more interesting examples.
Thank you, Fuad. Thank you all for coming today at 5 p.m. To hear about the policy that shall not be named. And I want to clear something right away. We look alike, but we're not brothers. Not even the same continent, actually. But anyway. So Fuad mentioned the comparison between Korea and Malaysia in terms of car industry. So Malaysia is a great laboratory because they did a lot of things right, in terms of skills, infrastructure, governance. This is a country that's pretty successful. It's a high middle-income country and, converging toward high income, although not at the same speed as Korea and Taiwan. Now, we talked about the car industry, but now what's interesting is that on the surface, Malaysia looks pretty much like, let's say, the Taiwanese and the Koreans. So they export a lot of electronics. It's a big share of their exports. It's relatively sophisticated. So why aren't they, as rich as the Taiwanese and the Koreans? So if you go back to the genesis of how the electronic sector was created in this economy, you will discover the hand of the state, what Fuad called the leading hand of the state. So first of all, there was by the way, all great questions. So there was a question about replicability. So when the Taiwanese entered the electronic sector, which is a frontier sector in the 70s, they were at the level of Tunisia today. So not low income, but not super rich, right? And the way they did it is actually pretty interesting. So what they did is that, first of all, they used different elements to attain this goal. They invested in skills for years. They would send thousands of students abroad, but they really focused on electronics, right? Early on, starting in the mid-60s, they would send thousands, all of them in electronics, and all of them to the Silicon Valley. No conditions of return. At the same time, they started building the basis of this sector at home, which entailed creating actually an umbrella institution called E3, which at some point was employing more than 10,000 people. So this is a huge operation, right? This is the equivalent of something like NIH or NASA. And this umbrella institution had the task of solving all the bottlenecks and thinking about all the issues related to electronics, including almost directly creating the first firms in this sector. So what's interesting with this spin-off system is that the state, through different indirect tools, helped train people, bring them back, and then spin off. So this E3 has its own public research institute that would license a new technology, relatively frontier technology, bring it back, and then they would spin off a new firm. So these people who were quasi-civil servant overnight, they would become entrepreneur, and then they would start growing their own company. So what's interesting is that it was relatively cheap, at least in terms of seed money in the first years. So one of the first firms that was created was UMC, and today it's one of the biggest semiconductor companies in the world. And say second or third firm they spun off is TSMC, which is the biggest firm in its field, right? I think it weighs something like $44 billion today, if I'm not mistaken. But it's a huge, huge actor. So extremely successful. And despite all of this, they had troubles raising private money at that time. So the private sector was not willing to take that risk, although ex post, the profits were huge. So that, I hope, answers some questions about replicability, but also about the importance of domestic firms versus foreign firms. So if you compare the strategy of the Taiwanese and the Malaysians relied on FDI. So they would bring foreign companies in electronic. They would do some assembly and then export. So on the surface, they export electronics, relatively sophisticated. But the difference is that the Taiwanese had their own firms doing it since the beginning. Now, to illustrate the concept that countries need to innovate to grow fast, usually, as Fuad said, we think about the average. So if you look at the average, countries at some level of development would do some level of innovation. And you would expect low-income countries to do no innovation, middle income, some level, and so on and so forth. But if you look at the outliers, Korea, one of our examples, this graph is meant to show you at what speed the Koreans were innovating themselves. So the red curve is the number of patents per million issued in the US to Korean firms, right? This is in logarithm. So this is the red curve throughout the years. The blue labels are the different countries that Korea surpassed in terms of GDP per capita at a certain year. And by the way, whenever they passed the country, there was no going back, right? They kept diverging. So what you see is that in the early 70s, this is Philippines. They have the level of income of Philippines, Tunisia. And then something started happening in the early 80s. While they were relatively, poor country yet. So they have the income of Brazil. They do much more innovation. Chile, huge gap. These are logs. So in absolute terms, these are pretty big differences. Much more than Malaysia, much more than Mexico, and it continues. Huge gap with Portugal and so on and so forth. And then today, even compared to many other advanced countries, they do much more innovation, homegrown innovation, technology creation by domestic firms. So the point of this kind of story is to say that if you think that GDP per capita is a good predictor of many of the ingredients of innovation, right? Governance, skills, infrastructures, etc. The Korean seems to be doing much more than what this income would predict. So there is something about this effort, determined effort to innovate early on. Now, the second question relates to, okay, so you told us sophistication is important, innovation is important, indirectly R&D, right? To get to this innovation, you do R&D. The question is, who is responsible for R&D and how to go about it? So if you look at this kind of spider graph, if you want, which is a breakdown of how R&D or who is responsible for R&D in OECD countries. So the blue area is the median OECD country, and then you have red and the dashed black line, which is Finland, and red is Korea. These are two top performers in terms of innovation. So I think we'll put the slides online so you look at them later, but the bottom line is the following. The good performers in terms of innovation, the R&D, first of all, most of the R&D is done by the private sector, about 2/3. So the government, yes, can increase R&D, but you really need the firms to do R&D and to do it in the right sectors. The second thing is that most of the R&D is done by big firms. So, policies that only focus on SMEs may not lead to this result. Yes, maybe SMEs in the beginning, but they need to scale up. Big firms. The second trait is that most of the R&D is done in industry, in fact, in high tech. So non-tradable services don't seem to be promising. And then the third crucial point is that most of the R&D is done by domestic firms, not by foreign affiliates. So this technology creation by domestic firms seems to be crucial. So that already gives you elements of the type of policies you would need to raise your R&D. Now, how do you go about it? Okay, so we know the principles. Fuad talked about them, these three principles. You need to go into these sophisticated sectors, but you need some kind of strategy to do it, especially in today's world. I think there was a question about that. So what we conjecture is that you need really to take care of incentives. So the point is change incentives for both firms and workers to start moving into these more sophisticated sectors and do more innovation. So just to illustrate, so one point would be, for example, to have purpose-specific investment in skills and infrastructure. What does it mean? So it means that if your goal is to develop a certain sector, it would require a certain type of skills, a certain type of infrastructure. So when policy claims to be neutral or horizontal, in fact, there's always implicitly a type of industrial policy. So if you build a road versus a railway, if you invest or send people to study electronic or tourism, these have very different implications. And then there's business support. So you have to think about all these bottlenecks, right? So you need funding. You need procurement to help them innovate. And you need also export promotion agencies, as Fuad mentioned. This is a very important element. In terms of workers, of course, there's education. I'm not going to go over this. There's a lot of work on that. So education is very important, especially quality of education. But there are also things that could be done in developing countries that would emulate what happened in Korea, which is this program called Samolundong, which is a social development program to change, if you want, the attitude of people in the countryside initially and then in the cities. In the more advanced countries, I guess the idea would be to push toward more entrepreneurship, more risk-taking, especially in sophisticated sectors. So these are kind of broad principles. But the real question is, how do you apply these principles today? Because most people think that industrial policy today is impossible. So our guiding principle is the following. Yes, please, 5 minutes. Yeah. So industrial policy is already happening. The countries or the best performers in terms of innovation, they're already doing it. The question is how to first detect the principles we conjectured with Fuad, and then how do you emulate them in today's world. So 3 examples. First of all, the rise of Nokia in Norway. What's important to, Nokia in Finland. The most important to note is that the government procurement played a huge role in the rise of Nokia. So there's a way to do it. So the government, asked the operators to build this wireless system and really helped Nokia start. There are also parallels in terms of institution. There's this umbrella institution that was in the Taiwanese economy, existed also in Finland. There's also this relationship between university and industry. So the Swiss are a great example. This is a country that has extremely innovative enterprises, but if you dig deeper, you will see that there are a lot of, state policy programs to encourage this collaboration between its universities and, oops, I lost the slides. Okay, between its universities. Okay, between its universities and its enterprises. So this is a second example. So you could use procurement. You could have the right institution. You could use this collaboration between universities and enterprise. And the last example is Singapore. Singapore, how they created this biotech sector. So starting in the 2000s, they had this vision that electronic was great, but they had to move to biotech. And they had all these steps. They put together the infrastructure. They invested in the skills. They changed even their ethic laws. So you see a state thinking about all the bottlenecks at the same time. So just kind of a very quick question to your question, a very, very quick answer to your question, is the government smart enough? The question is not about intelligence, but who is able to solve coordination problems? And the only actor is the government. That's exactly its role. So finally, to conclude, so the question, to make a miracle, our conclusion is that what you need is to create winners, not pick them. The key is spur export for sophisticated industries, precisely because this is where the R&D intensity is and the innovation. And how do you do it? You need to tackle both government failures. This is what we all know, avoid high inflation and things like this. But also you need to tackle market failures. These are reality. Competing on the international market is very important, not to replicate the mistakes of the 70s in terms of import substitution. You need to move to the frontier early on. It depends on your ambition. And you have to enforce market discipline and accountability. These are very important ingredients. So you have to pick sectors, not specific firms. And you need to preserve competition. Now, finally, to implement this strategy that we call TIP, Technology and Innovation Policy, one of the key elements is this purpose-specific investment. Any investment the state does, it has to have in mind these kind of strategic sectors. So to finish, I'll finish with this quote from Albert Hirschman. When we think about developing economies, it's hard to think that they can innovate, but innovation always comes as a surprise. In the sense, you have to force yourself to innovate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Joaquim, let me invite you to the podium. We've asked you to act as discussant, but also to insert some of your own thoughts and reflections on industrial policy. So hopefully your slides should be straight on after.
Yeah, it should come. Okay, well, first, great to be talking to you. And it's great to, have the opportunity to discuss such an important topic. And of course, you did mention, but I did have my time also in the IMF, so it's good to see that. I try to think that perhaps the three main messages of this great paper is first, you have to believe that you can do something special, and you have to find a way to marshal the forces, the agreement in the country to do that, because nothing that happened was easy. The second thing is that, you have to look and try to pick, if you really want to skyrocket, an industry that has a tremendous, scope for increasing productivity. One of the reasons why the growth of Korea started after the 80s is because before the 80s, most of Korea was heavy industry, which was what most people was doing. And if it was, if they kept with the heavy industry, probably they would not be doing that. So they picked electronics. They had create in a way the basis for that, for having the human capital to do this, and then also to have the organization, including all the financing, to be there. But we could say there are two times in Korea history, which was before, when they were doing the traditional industrialization process, where Hyundai has shipyards, and then when they moved to electronics. And then the third thing I think is important. Yes, exports are a great way to ensure discipline. So I think the three, in a way, what is said are capturing these three principles. Get the infrastructure to support the business, and also have the big ambition, get export. I don't know, the third one is really easy to apply. Now, we have to say, and I think that's what the provocation is, that, yeah, we got 2 countries that did very well. And then there are many countries that had industrial policy that didn't work well. And then with hindsight, I'd say, well, it's because there was import substitution, so there was no export. And because there was no export, you didn't have this discipline where you don't get just, say, government handouts or just increase your price because you have to compete with the rest of the world. You have many countries have a really hard time to get a lot of people getting education. We have to remember that in both countries, not only they had a long, let's say, history of education. I remember reading articles from the 50s. I was not alive at the time, but I read the articles on the 50s, say from any magazine, American magazines, talking about, I mean, how literacy in Korea had a long history, and education is so important. Of course, Taiwan also had this, and many countries have trouble to get their working force educated. Not only universities, because you get universities if you get first the basic education for all the population, and then also opening ways to get it. I think that the question of savings in the paper they mention, and they also mention that some countries have high saving rates but don't go very far. I think it depends also a bit the source of the savings. Is it savings that come from, say, natural resources and you just save, or is savings that come from, say, reinvest, pure capitalism, state capitalism, but capitalism like in Korea, and also individual household savings that are very high in both countries. And of course, no doubt that planning, having this institutional capacity. He mentioned the I3 or whatever. We know in India, the technological institute, even in Brazil, the first picture I had, in the first slide, is Embraer. This was the result of many years investing in the aeronautics industry by creating the human capital. And I think there is one point also, which is this question about having domestic firms with the right incentives. Foreign firms are great, but foreign firms are not going to develop, say, patents in your own country. So you have to have a balance between, say, global companies in your country that may bring a number of advantages, new practices, we increase also the consumer experience of people. But if you really want to be strong in a field, you have to have your own companies. This was known in the UK 100 years ago, and I think it continues to be true. Now, one question. When you talk about industry, I mean, electronics at that time was what you had the high, say, potential for productivity growth. What is today? That's the risk. Sometimes people do take the wrong boat. It's not always easy to find exactly what it is. But it's certain that today artificial intelligence, some areas in biology can be very productive. Although you have to think, I mean, Japan has been investing in biology for 30 years since they finished their cycle with electronics, and they didn't get much result. So there is a little bit of luck, perhaps, there. But structures are important. And actually, today, for instance, it's very fashionable that everybody goes after, say, startups. Is the startup really the best way to get a structural change in a country? Or more structured, say, instance like they mentioned in Korea, is still the way to go and to have very strong, say, universities and so on today. Now, there are a few things that we should question also in this paper, and I try here just to list a few ones. The first one is that, yes, exports are very important, but this may not apply to everybody. Many countries have done that in different ways, but there is a problem sometimes if you're big, this may not work as well. I think Japan is a really classical case. Japan had the same size type of growth of Korea, but then it got to a size where it really started to bother other countries. And I'm sure that some of you are familiar with the history of Japan after the mid-80s. And for a combination of macro, let's say, economics, decisions, and so on, they moved away from being basically exported-oriented. It became much more non-tradable. All of you have heard about the bubble, the real estate bubble. Okay, this also shows that in addition to the points that were raised, macro plays a very important role. And some of the successful countries that they may have not grown that much because they have not invested in areas, sectors that had such a potential of growth like electronics, macro plays an important role, both bringing stability, bring an exchange rate that doesn't kill all the domestic companies, and things like this. Of course, now China, which in some ways has also followed the path of Korea. The only thing that they're so big that the kind of an example that you gave, you don't apply. You don't see they going up at the chart the same way just because they have such a big country that, again, you cannot have, say, export-led growth, and especially if it's in a narrow sector, having the same effect in a country as big as China as you had in Korea. And mind you, now that China has become big, there has been a kind of, say, a pushback also in China. So exporting is great. You can grow a lot using export, but there are limits, especially for big countries. And then just again, I think that if you don't rely on export, discipline for industrial policy becomes much more difficult. And my experience, and I remember talking this with Mariana Mazzucato, is that the only cases where I see discipline with the industrial policy, when you're not talking export, where it comes from abroad, is when you are under threat. So when you were in a war and so on, yeah, government comes in, government works with the private sector, and private sector has a discipline, and you have the instruments, and you get great results. And in a way, both Korea and also Taiwan are part of their ethos was also for security reasons. So I think the set of very special conditions that, of course, doesn't take any merit from those countries or from your analysis, but possibly is not totally replicable. Just applying these thoughts, in the case of Brazil, we have some cases of industrial policy that went very well and some that were not so good. So the export-oriented, you have Embraer. We even have agriculture where we don't have, say, 10 times increase in productivity, but you have tripling of productivity, and even commercial forests. There was nothing a few years, 20, 30 years ago. Now we are very competitive, and you continue to be more and more productive there. On the other hand, back in the 80s, a genius invented that we had to do computers and microcomputers in Brazil. And for 20 years, we didn't produce anything meaningful. And then we opened the market, and you just put together things, but basically everything is important. You don't have a technology in microcomputers or in electronics or anything like this. Cars is an example of this dichotomy between domestic and foreign. We had, for 50 years, all sorts of companies in Brazil, which also is fantastic in terms of strong industry, but it's all foreign. Actually, like 30 makers instead of having 2 or 3, which means that they cannot export because they don't have even the size for doing that, and so on and so forth. Where I mentioned about when you have something that goes to the national security, oil, and also ethanol. There, in a way, there was a discipline. Not perfect at all, but there was a fundamental discipline where the government would have enough say, power to get things running in the right way, and the incentives align. So I would say that you have this combination of, say, you have to have the right incentives. You also have to have the right, say, financial or macro policy. Financial in terms of many countries don't have a real market, and in some cases the market will not be willing to take the risk for some of these new ventures. So you do need to have support from the government, and you need also an exchange rate that helps the domestic companies. Final thought here. Transparency is something that sometimes is not very favorable for this type of arrangement, because in many cases you get to protect an industry, you really have to get something informal, flexible, and you start to have direct contacts. It's not that you put a program, you issue, say, some terms of reference for a program and people will come. Usually it's not the way it works. So the way we understand transparency sometimes doesn't help. You can have the accountability, although frankly, the accountability that you can say, well, you had success, all your sins are forgiven. You don't have success, well, maybe you continue. It depends. It's very complex. And when we talk about transparency and democracy, sometimes it's hard to have industrial policies in the traditional sense. If you give me 2 minutes, just because of the climate change, I mean, we all have to give a special space for climate change. I think that there's no doubt that climate change, because it's so big, requires government intervention. It's a game of coordination. It's a game where people may free ride and so on and so forth. Now, when you start to say, okay, I accept the government intervention, then how you do it? Okay, and there I think there's still a lot to be learned. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think now it's really the time to think about it. One of the simple things is, should you say, put your effort, suppose you raise a tax, a carbon tax, whatever. How do you use this? You give back to people and that's it. You try to create a demand and give a subsidy for certain types of things, or you put the money on the supply side, say, supporting research. I think there's no clear response for that, but I think this will be more and more the kind of questions that finance ministers you'll be asking, especially because, well, more likely you're going to have some sort of a carbon tax in the next few years. I think if you believe competition is good, usually to go and support demand is better, because then you open the field for anybody to respond to this additional demand. This is a little bit why I like the concept of the net zero. You give a long-term target, you may start to give incentives, and then you count from the ingenuity of many different people. Someone mentioned the private sector. Everybody can come and go in this race with a clear objective. There is a question of regulation. This is more specific, but very, very important. The good thing about climate change is that exactly because of this ingenuity, we start to have things that really expand the production frontier. So we're not going to save the world just because you don't eat meat, just rhubarb. You can have a nice meeting. You can still have a funny life. But there are new things, say solar panels and things like this. And in some cases, they're so good, there's so much of a gain in productivity that you have an excess that you can split that so that you can have these moving. Very simple example here. If you do, for instance, solar energy in some places in the United States today, you'll be cheaper than if you do, you keep with the coal. Now, there is a regulatory issue. Should we split this difference and use that to compensate, A, the investor, who still has the right for X years of concession with coal, the workers, because coal involves a lot of workers, or you should switch and give back all the benefit to the consumer. Now, this is a public policy. That's very important, because if you just give everything for the consumer, probably we're not going to have the switch, because nobody is going to compensate the losers. So nobody wins. if you split, you can use part of these, maybe a large part of these, to compensate the losers. And you have the new technology, you have the climate benefits, and maybe you even have some reduction in rate further on. So again, this is something that makes a huge difference, how much the government is willing to participate. And I mentioned it again, the taking care of losers. This sounds a ring for you, a bell for you, that when you have a huge changes, it's better to take care of losers so you don't have problems later on. So also, the kind of technology that you use can be helpful. One example, I've been looking at hydrogen and even ammonia. What is the beauty of that? If you try to electrify everything at once, not only is it extreme cost, but also you may create big displacements and the jobs. If you do hydrogen and ammonia, this is quite close to what you have with natural gas and oil, which means that a lot of the structure, a lot of the players that are here can participate, and through some adjustment also get a little bit of the pie. They're not completely, disruption is nice, but you cannot have disruption everywhere. So also to pick choices that can involve more people and reduce the transition costs. I think most of the things that we're talking about is how you address transition costs, how you accelerate by giving incentive to the right people, how you minimize the cost through, for instance, regulations, and when you think in a global level, and some people talked about fairness between developed and developing countries, how do you think that, for instance, again, if you think about hydrogen and ammonia from solar, it means that you create a huge, huge market for energy produced by electricity, and then hydrogen produced by solar energy in countries in the tropical area, which means you could get really a meaningful source of income from many countries in Africa and in many other places. So I stop here. I think it's a great contribution. It's not that easy to repeat. Replicability is not that easy, but I think you touched some of the key points. And these, I think that if this helps people and governments to believe that it is possible, it's a great thing. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Let's sit. Great. Thank you. Sit down. Great. Thank you very much to all three of you. So there's some really thought-provoking presentations there. Perhaps what I would do first is let Cherif and Reda and Fuad respond to any of these provocations. Particularly, I think, thank you very much, Joaquim, for putting politics on the table. And so the politics about how we make this happen. Particularly some questions there about democratic plurality and where lobbying and transparency might not actually be helpful. So we often get this sort of, is this only possible where you've got a very strong centralized government? So perhaps some of those questions. An intriguing phrase there of sort of size matters. Is this sort of process of export-led industrial or structural transformation acceptable to the world when it's really the large country? So is this something that China can do? But anything else you want to pick up on? So just a quick thought, and then we'll come perhaps a couple of questions that didn't get answered, and we'll open up to some more questions from the group.
All right, thanks a lot. Thank you, Emily. Thanks, Joaquim. Great comments. So it's tough to respond when I agree with most. So.
Yeah.
But the first thing I want to say is this is something we've been thinking about. It's a really great point about these different outcomes within Brazil. So you have one country, one type of institution, one setup, and you have very different outcomes. So you have Embraer on one hand, which is more or less along the lines of TIP. And then you have completely different outcome for auto industry, which was more into import substitution or electronics. So I think it's a great example to see that even within one country, you can have very different outcomes because the policies differ. That's kind of also the example of Malaysia. On the other, in terms of replicability, this is absolutely right that it was a particular context. You mentioned that security was very high on their mind, so they were kind of cornered in a sense. But also what really played a big role is that they didn't have natural resources. So in a sense, they really had to generate those hard currencies. So one could even claim that they didn't do import substitution because they couldn't. And if they had the natural resources, they would have done the same as many others. So that's true. But the hope is also maybe the observation is that many countries were under similar conditions, and yet they took different paths, right? Because the emphasis is very important, right? So they could do a mix of one or two elements, but not the third one. So that's our hope, is that, once a strategy more or less clear, maybe it helps countries when they are in the right conditions. We're not political scientists, so I don't know how to create those institutions. So maybe I'll leave Fuad
So
to...
I'll add, so the issue of kind of the democratic plurality and strong state, right? Yes, in many of these cases, you had a relatively strong state, and in some cases, not even democracies early on. The issues, though, I mean, Japan was kind of democratic, although it was pretty much one-party system for many years. But it's the issue of kind of going back to the issue of institutions. How do you create the institution that kind of survives all these political cycles? So MITI in Japan, Ministry of Industry and Trade, kind of was one of these institutions. Economic Development Board in Singapore, although it was kind of one-party system, they still had kind of close ear of the prime minister, and then kind of permeated throughout the whole state structure. So it's still possible within the democracies, but you do need capable state at the end of the day. Of course, you cannot have weak state and kind of create. But these are quite complicated stuff. Quite complicated issues, right? So you need the strong state, but you don't necessarily need to have kind of dictatorship or something of similar kind. So that's one. On the issue of exports, I mean, Lucas mentioned that you need to be able to make a miracle, you have to be a large exporter. I mean, the U.S. used to be much more closed economy, so 10 to 15% of its GDP was trade, like 40, 50 years ago. Now it's much more open, 30% or so. So China is the same, big country. I mean, the pie is not fixed, right? The pie can grow. So, and if you look at the trade, we buy and sell cars and cheese to each other, right? So it's the issue of variety and scope, right? So kind of going back to econ theory. So we don't have to think within this fixed pie. So it's in a way kind of fallacy to think so.
And just maybe to add a comment, it's such a great example, right? Japan in the 80s, which was along many dimensions similar to China, maybe smaller, but also very successful exporting, a lot of surpluses. But also at that time, I mean, if you read about the history of Japan at that time, is that they would export pretty much everything from low tech to high tech, textile, chemicals, cars, and that kind of led to a pushback, right? Because at the same time, their market was pretty much closed to foreign operators. So that was part of it. But as Fuad said, in a sense, you can have a big country exporting a lot, provided that other big countries also grow, at least at similar pace. I mean, if India grows faster or keeps growing at this pace, it could be a huge market for import. So, I mean, it's difficult to predict, right? So, in a sense, what we're saying is pretty generic. Maybe it's non-linear, right? If you have huge countries, you have other issues. But at least for the average countries, would be more or less.
It's replicable.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. There was an intriguing question earlier about international organizations keeping up with all of this and actually providing good advice. The title of your paper is the industrial policy. All three of you worked at the fund. You don't have to talk about the fund, but generally, how well positioned are often quite big conservative international organizations to keep giving good practical advice? So for a long time, this was not talked about. This was a set of policy prescriptions that were sort of off the cards for international organizations. You're now bringing them, starting to name them again. But what does it take for an international organization to stay at the forefront of this? Are there lessons to be learned from this?
So if I guess let me start. No, it's a tough question.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you go back in time, there was a discussion about industrial policy. I mean, kind of we forgot about it in the 80s and 90s. I think even in the World Bank, when Justin Dean was there as chief economist, it kind of came back under a different name. And then even at the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, kind of was also, it also came back under a different name. And even now, there's, of course, there's a lot of discussion because we also see it's happening in the advanced countries, right? We hear about French and German kind of industrial manifesto. Even in the UK, now it's called industrial strategy, but effectively it's also industrial policy.
Yeah.
So I think, the realization that, the successes of the past, including before the Asian miracles, before the 19th century US, Germany, Britain, they did a lot of state intervention, promotion of manufacturing and particular industries. So, and the tech sector that Joaquim mentioned, the Cold War investments, right? So the whole tech sector today was pretty much a child of the investments in the 50s and 60s, right? So these things I think are coming back, given that we have this kind of increasing polarization, middle income polarization. We have inequality, declining productivity growth. So I think these things are coming back now.
Politicians everywhere are looking for answers. Yeah, Joaquim.
Take a bit of the provocation of that you did. It's very hard for an international organization not to deal with the mean, or at least with the median. So as you said, if you're talking about a tail, every tail is a tail. Every country has and then it becomes really. If an international organization were to advise on industrial policy, really, you would have to understand what are the real drivers of successful industrial policy. And it might, like they say, well, try export as part of it. I think the missing thing is that take a shot on something that has a real enormous potential of productivity growth and go for it and do the education that comes for that. Now, I don't know if the international organization would have the convincing power to lead countries to do the kind of discipline, the effort, the high savings, and everything that goes to see this type of outcome. This basically has to come intrinsically from the country itself. So yes, they should not be against some of the things. Sometimes they may be a little bit worried because things can, slip. But it's very hard for them to give advice.
Departure, kind of median.
But then you see, look, for whatever reason, again, political scientists may look. When you had the crisis in 97, 98, there was a lot of discussion of changing the structure of the Korean economy, the financing. I was at the bank at that time. I remember these discussions, as it was also with the case of Japan. But truth is that the Korea weathered, navigate through the 97, 98 crisis. And yes, there was change. There was democratization, but some of the key things are still there. The shy ball, you may have a different name, but you still have three big companies that have a real integrated, kind of nexus for the whole production. So, and the fund had some advice, but didn't push that you have to dismantle this. It didn't even have the levers to force the Koreans to dismantle. So advice, the average. But then the best you can say is respect, some idiosyncratic things of the countries, sometimes pointing out that, for instance, I remember the fund saying at the time that, well, all your savings scheme, your financial structure is nice, but there's a little bit of financial repression there, which means that the worker, the investor, is getting less. And then it's a national decision. Should you try to give a little bit more to the consumer or continue to concentrate for results?
Call there to make sure that the national government has quite a lot of autonomy whether or not the funds always allowed sort of that to happen, I guess, is the open question for many people. I can see a load of hands going up. Let's go and collect a lot of more comments. I can see at least 6 or 7, so let's sweep around the table, or the room, sorry. Yeah, let's start on this side. I can see question here and then one behind you. Yeah.
Micros.
We have a mic. Oh, yeah, great. Thank you, Jolie. You've got the roaming mics. No, not first. Is it on? If not, please shout. Yes.
I thought it was very interesting forensic analysis. I thought it was an interesting forensic analysis of basically the winners, Korea, Singapore, etc. But I suppose it's a matter of history that they found the solutions from within their own resources largely. And what I'm particularly curious about is the role nowadays, particularly in the poorest countries, the role nowadays of external agencies, if those agencies have a role. Obviously, you know, the IMF and the World Bank, DFID, USAID. So it's the role of external agencies in bringing about the sort of conditions that you've analysed as being the successful components.
Great. We can perhaps add for that private finance, which a lot more countries are tapping into global financial markets as well. Question just behind you. Sorry, I forgot to say, please do introduce yourselves as well.
Hi, I'm Yella Santiago. I study biology, and my question is, more related, I guess, to the innovation and research and development side of things. So you talked about how innovation in sophisticated industries like tech and biopharma, as well as like innovation in universities, are very important for sustainable growth. Now, some countries, and certainly mine, the Philippines, limits funding are starting to limit funding in science, both in the public and private sectors, and are trying to push science in the direction of these innovations that we were talking about, that of these fast-growing industries. But science cannot always be forced into innovation. It needs to grow organically, and many scientific breakthroughs are discovered by accident or occur in places where we do not expect breakthroughs to occur. And as you mentioned as well, investments don't always lead to these breakthroughs, and sometimes this pressure can even lead to scientific malpractice, especially in industries like biopharma. So I guess the bottom line of this is that all kinds of science need funding in order to diversify and improve and advance, not just the sectors that the government has identified to be good for their economic policy. So my question is, how do we achieve a sustainable compromise between economic policy and scientific advancement, especially in countries that don't have the resources to, that don't have enough resources to go around for both of them?
Great, thank you very much. Nicely illustrated trade-off there. There's a question just at the back. We've got another mic. We've got another mic on this side, so if you've got people close by, I can see there's one down here and then one there if you go there. Thank you, Lucy. And there's one in the front here. Yes, please.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I'm Eric Chang, studying public policy here. So one of the tips offered for growth is to intervene to create new capacities in sophisticated industries. So does this vindicate China's autonomous innovation strategy, which attracted suspicions from the United States and triggered the trade war? And I have a second area of concern is about the sustainability of industrial policies in these countries that have grown rich. So a lot of the successes quoted in the study are successes in, for example, Taiwan, Japan, and Korea from the good old days, 60s, 70s, 80s. And these countries or economies seem to be suffering from economic stagnation more or less after the quick growth period. And so but actually the institutions of these countries originally contribute to success in the first place. So is this type of strategy suggested have a continued sustainability?
Great, thank you. Let's take one more for this round and we'll come around to a second round in a moment. Yeah, this gentleman is right next to you.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Hakeem. I'm doing the Masters of Public Policy program here at the Blavatnik. My question is, in very low-income countries, there seems to be the focus on survival at some level. So I'm going to use a point on increased exports. The question is for a very low-income country that is trying to achieve food security for our citizens. After how many years are they supposed to now start thinking of exports? Can they do it side by side? And how should they manage those trade-offs?
Great, thank you. Another question on trade-offs there. Joaquim, you want to come back on any of these questions?
Me?
Yeah, you.
Tough one.
I thought I'd start with you this time around, yes.
Yeah, I think that there are these two questions about how you deal with poor countries, what could be the role of say, aid agencies. I think that you have to go to the basics because as Cherif both mentioned, if you didn't have the education, you would not have been able to achieve that. And this is like soccer or sports. You have to have a big base. So everybody having some level of education so that you start to get the people that can make a difference in a higher level. So,
but there's an important thing what you're saying there, because it's not just primary education, which is often what we've seen post the Millennium Development Goals. It's also then investing in high tertiary education.
You go to the second level, then the thing is that you have to go step by step so that you get the maximum people. Because also, again, he mentioned trade. You can also make trade and education in some case. In a way, for a while, you may send people abroad until you get a critical mass, and then you have a higher education. If you have enough people that are really good. So I think to have these balances there. And in terms of advice and in terms of aid, I think this is fundamental. I think the question about food security is very interesting. We have to see how you balance. Any country usually needs some amount of foreign currency to do a minimum thing. So some sort of foreign trade is needed. And I think that very seldom would be the cause of hunger in a country. Hungry, you'll be for many other things, social, even land tenure or war, more than necessarily a thing. We don't want to be a full plantation, but I think it's good. And also it creates a stronger business sector that will start to have impact in other areas.
If I understand the question well, it's also the question of, from what we've discussed, innovation is a huge amount of government resources that you've got to put into getting innovation really going. And if you're trying to do some more basic things, how do you balance those trade-offs? Because one is sort of the long-term thing about structural transformation. The other is schools and hospitals for very pressing needs today.
Well, again, there are many ways of doing this. We all know that, in the ideal world, you can get a lot in terms of health by doing prevention, by doing things at low cost. Then it's really the realm of implementation, the realm of political, say, dynamics rather than pure, say, advice per se. The thing is that in many countries, the problem is that you allocate your capital, your resources in a bad way, sometimes responding to different pressure. And this is true both in democracy and in authoritarian government.
Great, thank you. There's a question on the table. China, so they're pursuing this type of industrial policy. It's provoked a global trade war. So are there limits to?
I'm not sure this is the pursuit of this principle, right? I guess what is discussed is some of the tools, right? Not that China is trying to have its own technology. Most countries are trying to have their own technology, including advanced countries. So I think it's more the other tools than the fact, this basic fact. I just want to come back. I'm not dodging this question, but I want to come back to this very interesting question about, they're trying to survive and there was the priority. So there's a book called Korea Story Upside Down by a former minister of Trade and Innovation, actually, Minister Choi, who's also at the World Bank. So he frames it in this way. He says, the question is, should I invest in a hospital or a factory? And then he says, yes, hospital may help, but sometimes you need a factory because you will pay 10 more hospitals, the doctors, the medicine. So that's the kind of really the trade-offs. But then also what we try to formalize with Fuad is, in terms of strategy, what you need is both quick wins and then some transformative sectors at the same time. Exactly as Joaquim mentioned, you need some exports. And what's really interesting with the Koreans is that despite the fact that they started investing early on in shipyards, in boats, in shipyards, in automotive and electronics, right, in the 70s, until 1990, their biggest exports in terms of industries was footwear. Right? So they kept doing textile for a long time. Why? Because exactly that was the hard currency they needed to buy equipment, train people, and so on and so forth. So it's not either or. It's
So
just
some
at the
sort of
same
sure
time.
bets, and
Exactly.
then some of these more risky.
Exactly. And at the same time, those who succeed are the ones who are able to kind of encourage this creative destruction. When do you give up footwear and then move to electronics, right? That's not easy.
And this question about science research, there's a risk then if you're trying to channel everything so that it's productive fairly immediately for technology, there's a risk that you're going to miss actually these sort of moonshot opportunities and these new discoveries.
But also, yeah, good. I mean, innovation is not just breakthroughs. You have to look at it at the level of each country, right? When you're trying to reverse engineer something that exists from outside, doesn't look new, but given your own capabilities, this is an innovation, right? So it's really kind of taking the innovation mindset and system to move, right? Rather than expecting low-income countries to invent, new medicine right away. But that should be the goal eventually.
Great, that long-term thinking. Let's get another cluster of questions and comments from the floor. This is our last round, so we're going to pull as many as we can. There's one hand here, there's 3 at the back, 4, 5, 6, there's a lot, 7, 8. All right, so keep them short. Let's try and cluster them all, and then I'm not sure we'll get responses to all, but let's at least get them on the table.
All right, I will be quick. My name is Oliver. I'm from the International Growth Centre upstairs, and apologies, I did turn up slightly late, so if this has been covered, I will slap my wrist. But I'd like to bring up kind of informality in the informal economy, which in a lot of the low-income countries, we're talking about kind of accounts for, half, 2/3 in Africa, like 85% of the GDP and employment. And kind of, I was reading your success factors around, the need for sophistication, export orientation, and strict accountability, and the kind of informal economy doesn't really seem to be, particularly sophisticated or export orientated or hugely accountable. So just how does it fit in with that huge weight on the informal economy in this?
Great, because that's actually the reality of where a lot of economies are.
Right.
Great, the 3 at the back here. Great, maybe Jolie can get those ones, and then perhaps you want to come forward, Lucy, and get ready for this. 2 at the front here. We're going to go as fast as we can and get as many as we can. Yes, please.
So my question is, why do you think that most poor countries aren't already doing this sort of thing? Because it seems unlikely that the reason is that they're not aware that they should be building up their industries. So there might be some other constraints, like political, institutional, that might be maybe the real problem for a lot of countries. So I'd be interested to hear your comments on that.
Great thought, thank you.
So I'm hoping you'll respond to one or more of these 3 sentences. 1, your comments on R&D needing to be controlled by firms were absolutely key. If corporations control R&D, they are, in essence, controlling industrial policy. 2, the role of government in sustainability should be in regulation, not in trying to control innovation. And 3, if we're going to have examples of other countries, we need examples for countries like these: Zambia, the Honduras, and Myanmar. Singapore, Taiwan, and China cannot be examples for these nations.
Okay, great. So kind of, and that last bit then, underscoring replicability. There's a question just behind you.
Hi, my name is Peter Maffedon. I'm a law undergraduate in Oxford, and my question was kind of in 2 folds. What role does the youth play in facilitating sustainable growth in low-income countries? How should governments, especially in Western Africa, particularly Nigeria, capitalize on their high and productive youth population?
Great. So the youth dividend that's much spoken about, how do we capitalize on it? Yes.
So I'm Jose Maria, doctoral student here working on decarbonization of electricity systems. So the way that you all describe the subject looks like we're talking about national governments. So I'm curious to understand your view on whether subnational governments are somehow relevant to this story, particularly thinking on many of the narratives that we get from China about the role of local governments spurring all of these innovative forces.
Great, thank you. There's a question just behind you.
Thank you so much. My name is Sam, and I'm a bit biased because I study MSc Agriculture and Development at Reading, and there's this research that's normally and the advice that was given to developing countries some years ago by World Bank and IMF that you should like tax more on agriculture and focus more on the modern economy. And we are talking about countries that are facing through issues like food security again. So do you tell them like you should move away from non-productive agricultural sector to, and you see, apart from the Asian economies, most of the economies that grew like in Europe and the US, they focused more first on feeding themselves. And then it's like the agricultural production was used as raw materials in manufacturing.
Yeah, brilliant. So really think about the role of agriculture in this whole
So what is the role
story.
of agriculture in this? Because I believe it has a huge role to play in developing
And we shouldn't
countries.
forget, in most developing countries, most people are employed in the agricultural sector. Gosh, I can see, I'm going to go to the front, and somebody's been waiting here, and then I know there was a question over here, and I'm afraid we're not going to get to everybody, I think. I'm going to take, there's one over here, and I'm afraid I'm going to do the cut-off at that point. I'm very sorry. Yes, please.
My name is Alejandro.
There's one here, Julie. Yeah, please do. Alejandro, that's fine. You go ahead. I'm just getting the mic there, so we'll try and speed us up a little bit. That's good.
Should I go? Yeah.
You're perfect.
Okay,
yeah, please do.
My name is Alejandro. I'm doing the Masters in Global Governance here. I'm wondering about how this policy relates to the original structural adjustment program of the IMF and the World Bank, and claims that it led to the lost decade of Latin America and created massive inequalities, and maybe some of the protests right now in Latin America could be tied to it. So is this a fix to the structural adjustment programs? And if it is, what is the relationship between this policy that you're proposing and not just growth, but also inequality? What implications is it going to have for inequality?
Links to inequality. Great, thank you. And last
Hello, my name is Poliana. I'm a student here at the MBP, the Master of Public Policy. And I would like to know your opinion because economy is shifting towards services. How can better developing countries explore it, considering this dilemma with exportations? How can we deal since economy is changing? And actually, what is the role of cooperation South-South and North-South on the development of technology? We were talking that actually technology grow to this international threat, to the support of the United States, also to those countries, to Malaysia, and a scenario of actually Cold War. So how can you deal with this? How can we better cooperate between countries?
Great, and we still have, I think, this question of how green should low-income industrial policies be. So just to add, I think that's a 10th question on our, and we have about 4 minutes. So this is going to be, I think you're going to have to pick the ones that you feel that you want to respond to immediately, and then if anyone feels that their question hasn't been answered, please come up at the end, and let's continue the conversation for a few minutes. But perhaps we'll go in the order in which you presented. Do you want to start?
All right.
Some of those?
So I guess the first question on informal economy. It's the issue of, which goes first, right? And the problem of informal economy is that there are no other sectors for many of these workers to go to, right? So they leave agriculture and there's not much manufacturing, so they end up pretty much in informal economy. So I would say this is important, what we talked about, to kind of move people away from informal economy and even agriculture eventually, because if you start becoming more productive, all these workers have to go somewhere, so they don't end up in informal economy. You need to have these other sectors. And usually it's manufacturing. So I'm not sure services is fine, again, but we talked about non-tradable services. There are not much tradable services, although it's kind of rising up. So the question still goes back to the sophistication. You can do existing stuff, but you still have to kind of gallop forward, right? And it's a combination of all these things that is important. You may need some manufacturing, although we're talking about robotization, that's still quite a way. And how much non-tradables can you do? Because you still need to generate foreign exchange and need productivity gains. All these things are still connected to kind of these three principles that we talked about, which connects to the issue of regulation, right? And it's not enough, because that's pretty much what most IFIs advise on. You kind of regulate the market, create a good business environment, and you step out of it, and kind of like the sprouts, all the firms will grow. I mean, history shows that's not really the case. Even kind of the examples that we talk about, maybe China may not be relevant for Zambia, but the principles are still relevant because these are the same principles that the US used, Britain used, Germany used, Japan used, and if you go back, it's pretty much the same. Manufacturing, high-tech sectors, or in those days was pretty high-tech. Even today, you know, you can do manufacturing pretty high-tech as well. So all these things are still kind of line up to the three principles we mentioned.
Great. Perhaps I can pitch, since you're working in the Africa area at the moment, it sounds to me like there's a big youth dividend question, there's an agriculture question, particularly that are on the table for that region. So when these skeptical governments come to you and say, how do I tackle jobs, what's the role for ag?
Maybe I should start with a disclaimer before it ends, right?
Oh,
We're not talking in the name of the IMF, right? This is independent research. So just to put
big
it,
disclaimer.
Exactly. It's
important
actually
that
on the first slide.
Great, thank you.
But in terms of agriculture, this is a very interesting question. So here's the dilemma about agriculture. If you do the right thing in agriculture, then you should do an agriculture that is high productivity agriculture. And if you take advanced countries as a kind of a benchmark, in most advanced countries, the proportion of people working in agriculture is less than 1%. So you will create an army or armies of unemployed. So if you don't have at the same time a strategy to absorb them in something productive, you're not going very far. So the question is, what type of agriculture? Yes, it might be needed. I mean, as we just discussed, you need some export and so on and so forth. But what do you do at the same time? And obviously, one of these is to do these industries that gives you hope for productivity gains. I guess it's kind of similar. The answer would be similar about this demographic dividends. We have all this youth coming, so you have to think about industries that would keep pace with this. You need to keep absorbing these young people, mostly that would come from the countryside, right? If hopefully productivity is increasing. Now, just to come back, maybe I'll take this opportunity. So the great question about why aren't they doing that? I mean, if you do some text analytics on all the kind of announcements by most countries in developing countries, it's a guess, right? But from what I saw or what we saw together, you'll see mostly things like tourism, agriculture, sometimes finance, right? A lot of non-tradables. So things that are not really the way we describe in our strategy. So unlike these Asian miracles, you see also sometimes emphasis on import substitution. So going back to the mistakes of the past, or where they do it, maybe there's a problem of accountability. So I'm not sure people are really aware. I mean, in other words, I'm saying we're hoping to have a real contribution here. And hopefully that's
so actually a really important thing is to make this, put this on the agenda and get countries to think differently about these industrial policies.
And then about the green, because we've been dodging that till now. Green energy. Actually, there's no reason why we should think about industrial policy in terms of all the industries, right? It's not about steel, something that pollutes, right? If you have to think about the industries of the future. And they're precisely these green technologies, right? Battery, electric cars, and so on and so forth. So if you take a parallel with the 70s and 80s, at the time when the Asian miracles were making those bets, I mean, one of the bets of today should be exactly green technology, renewables, battery technology. So it's really not inconsistent.
And actually could be an opportunity.
Exactly.
Great. Joaquim.
Well, a few comments. First, I think that the whole thing here is, I mean, if you can find sectors that have a big potential of growth because of increase of productivity. Now, how you call it is not very important. I try to make the point. We're in the service. I mean, is WhatsApp, it's easy services of what? I mean, today, why Israel is so rich? Because they're doing servers, which is basically computer programs that they can sell at zero cost for the whole globe. They're small. You produce for the whole globe, have an infinite market. I mean, they're getting extremely rich because of that. If any country goes to this, and why? Because you have huge, potential productivity. So what you're pointing, I mean, tourism basically the way it is not going to have the big leap. Now, there is a good question that the fellow from the back asked is, okay, there is a great act, forensic, about Korea. What is the next act for Korea. In China, we know they moved away from just going to a next stage from, say, footwear to high mechanics. They suddenly realized there was something called big data and artificial intelligence, and they made a big leap. If you look at what was the plan 5 or 6 years ago, was to go to the next stage, basically mechanical thing. And then they realized, no, that's not the way, and so they can do a leap. With all the consequences that some have hinted there, or maybe not. So this is one thing. It's productivity, whatever name, whatever sector you're talking. The second thing, I think it was a good point in the green. Yes, I think that's why I said, put some general incentives and let competition to provide the best answer. It's very hard to pick the right thing. In the case of even in these two cases, there was innovation, but the basic science came from elsewhere. They really focused very clearly on generated results from some science that was done, which is in part what China says today about artificial intelligence. The big issues have been dealt. Now have an army of people to make it happen, and with that get big leap in productivity. So I think these are there's not much debate on that. Now there's a hard question, which has to do with your initial conditions. It's yes, perhaps you have to be in a time for a while as you get enough force fat, just to do conventional things better, okay? And this even, I mean, there is a comment about informality. Well, for many years, most of the shops in Korea, in some countries, you'll be considered informal. I mean, you have a swing machine and you're doing, and you produce, and all of these arrangements that are. And then maybe you get to a level where you have enough human capital, and during this time you're breeding this human capital to make the big jump. So yes, you may have to think that you improve your agriculture. And improving agriculture, there is this question about where you move the people, but often has to do land tenure, arrangement, and so on. In Africa, we all know this is true also. So maybe for a while you go in a certain level, and then you get the right moment to make the
moonshot. But you've got to have your spaceship ready to strike the moon.
If you try it before, you're going to use all your resources, and you go nowhere. Now, the exact point is where the art is.
Yes, that moment of calibration, which is my moment to calibrate us to a close, I think. But it's been a really fascinating discussion. Thank you, all three of you, for participating and bringing these questions here and stimulating some of these big organizations to think differently, and hopefully a lot of governments to think differently, including maybe the British government in its new industrial strategy, and hopefully a green industrial strategy for Britain. But thank you very much. Please join me in thanking all three of our speakers tonight.